I stood in our living room, my college diploma still warm in my hands, when my stepmother Patricia cleared her throat and announced to the entire graduation party that I wouldn't be moving with them to their new city. The congratulatory chatter died instantly as she declared this house was too good for someone like me, while my father Brian remained silent in the corner. Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room, full of relatives who had just been celebrating my achievement. I looked around at their faces, some amused, others embarrassed, and simply said, "Have a safe move," with a calm smile. What none of them knew was the secret I'd been carrying for weeks. I had secretly purchased this very house last month, and tomorrow would bring some very interesting surprises. Standing there with my diploma memories flooded back to how this moment had been building for years. My mother, Sarah, died in a car accident when I was 12 years old, leaving my father, Brian, devastated and struggling to raise me alone. He worked as an insurance adjuster, barely making ends meet while dealing with his grief. When I was 15, he met Patricia at a community grief support group where she claimed to be widowed. She seemed like a blessing, at first bringing casseroles and offering to help with household tasks that Brian found overwhelming. The transformation happened gradually. Patricia moved in 6 months after they started dating, and within a year they were married. Initially, she treated me with kindness, even helping with homework and attending school events. But subtle changes began emerging. She would make comments about my mother being gone and how I needed to accept new family dynamics. When I left dishes in the sink, she would sigh loudly and tell Brian how some children never learned responsibility. If I forgot to take out the trash, she would spend 20 minutes explaining to Brian how certain teenagers showed no respect for their homes. By my junior year of high school, Patricia had masterfully repositioned herself as the victim of my supposed ingratitude. She convinced Brian that I was taking advantage of their generosity and needed to learn independence. What I discovered much later through text messages she accidentally left open on the family computer was how she had been systematically poisoning every relationship I had with extended family members. The messages were devastating to read. To my Aunt Margaret, she wrote, "Shannon just expects everything handed to him. He's becoming entitled and lazy. Brian works so hard and Shannon shows no appreciation." To my cousins, she sent messages describing me as selfish and manipulative, claiming I was bleeding Brian dry financially and showing no gratitude for everything we sacrifice. The most painful discovery was a message thread with her sister, where Patricia wrote, "I'm slowly getting Brian to see how Shannon is holding him back. Once Shannon graduates, we can finally start our real life together. Without his constant demands for money and attention, the kid needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around him." What made these messages particularly cruel was that none of them were true. Since my mother's death, I had been working part-time jobs to avoid burdening my father. I started at Murphy's Auto Repair when I turned 16, working every afternoon after school and full days on weekends. Jimmy Murphy, the owner, quickly recognized my work ethic and mechanical aptitude. I learned everything from oil changes to transmission repairs, and Jimmy often praised my reliability to other employees. Despite working 30 hours per week, I maintained a 3.8 grade point average throughout high school. I never asked Brian for spending money buying my own clothes and school supplies with earnings from the garage. When Patricia convinced Brian to stop contributing to my college fund during my senior year, claiming I needed to learn the value of money, I simply increased my work hours and took on additional weekend catering jobs with a local restaurant. Patricia's manipulation reached new levels during my college years. She convinced Brian that my student loans were teaching me responsibility, while simultaneously encouraging him to spend money on expensive jewelry weekend trips and her extensive wardrobe. She would show Brian credit card statements and claim they were investing in their future together, while describing my education as Shannon's personal choice that shouldn't impact our financial goals. The most insidious part of her manipulation was how she isolated me from family gatherings. She would plan events when she knew I was working or studying, then tell relatives that I chose work over family, or was too busy with school to care about anyone else. When I did attend gatherings, she would make subtle comments about my appearance, work clothes, or tired demeanor, painting me as someone who couldn't be bothered to make an effort for family. What I didn't realize until much later was that Patricia had been intercepting mail addressed to me throughout my senior year of high school. I had applied to several prestigious universities and qualified for significant scholarships based on my grades and work experience. Those acceptance letters never reached me because Patricia threw them away, wanting to ensure I attended the local state university, where I could continue living at home under her influence. The night before my graduation ceremony, I overheard a conversation between Patricia and Brian in their bedroom. Patricia was telling him how relieved she felt that I would finally be out of their hair, and they could start living like a real married couple. She described me as a constant reminder of Brian's past and suggested that maintaining distance would be healthier for everyone involved. Brian's response was weak agreement, showing how completely she had manipulated his perspective on our relationship. That conversation crystallized everything I had suspected but tried to deny. Patricia hadn't just been thoughtless or insensitive. She had been deliberately undermining my relationship with my father and extended family for years, systematically isolating me while positioning herself as the victim of my supposed selfishness. The graduation party announcement wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to remove me from their lives entirely. What nobody in that room knew was that I had been living a completely different reality for the past 2 years. While everyone believed I was just a mechanic's assistant earning minimum wage, I had actually built a thriving software development business under the pseudonym SM Digital Solutions. The transformation began during my sophomore year of college when I realized my computer science classes were teaching concepts I could immediately apply to real-world problems. Jimmy Murphy at the auto repair shop was struggling with an outdated inventory system that required manual paperwork for every part order. During slow afternoons, I started building a digital inventory management system that could track parts, predict maintenance schedules, and generate automated orders. Jimmy was amazed by the system's efficiency and offered to pay me for similar solutions. Word spread to other local businesses through Jimmy's referrals. I developed a customer management system for Sarah's salon, a scheduling app for Dr. Martinez's dental practice, and an inventory tracker for Thompson's hardware store. Each project paid between $2,000 and $5,000, which seemed incredible compared to my $12 per hour at the garage. My breakthrough came when Linda Patterson, who owned a regional restaurant chain called Hometown Eats, with locations across 3 states, heard about my work through Dr. Martinez's recommendation. She wanted a comprehensive mobile app that would allow customers to place orders for pickup or delivery, track loyalty points, and receive personalized promotions. The project was significantly more complex than anything I had attempted, requiring integration with payment processors, GPS tracking, and inventory management across multiple locations. I spent 4 months developing the app, working every evening and weekend while maintaining my regular jobs and college coursework. The sleep deprivation was brutal, averaging 3 to 4 hours per night, but I was driven by the potential this represented. Linda Patterson was thrilled with the final product, which increased her online orders by 40% within the first month of launch. She paid me $80,000 for the complete system, plus an ongoing maintenance contract worth $15,000 annually. Suddenly, I had more money in my bank account than my father earned in 2 years, but I kept this information completely private. Patricia's constant criticism about my irresponsible spending and financial immaturity made me realize that revealing my success would only create new problems. Over the following months, referrals from Hometown Eats led to contracts with other regional businesses. I built an e-commerce platform for a specialty food distributor, designed a booking system for a chain of fitness studios, and created an inventory management solution for a medical equipment company. Each project reinforced my reputation for reliable, high-quality work delivered on schedule. By the beginning of my senior year, SM Digital Solutions was generating between $8,000 and $12,000 monthly in revenue. I reinvested most profits into better equipment and online courses to expand my skills, but I also began saving substantial amounts in a separate business account that Patricia and Brian knew nothing about. The catalyst for purchasing the house came 6 months before graduation, when Jimmy Murphy mentioned during a casual conversation that he was worried about Brian and Patricia's financial situation. Jimmy had grown up with my father and occasionally heard neighborhood gossip about their mounting debt problems. He told me in confidence that Patricia had convinced Brian to take out a second mortgage on our house to fund what she described as investment opportunities and home improvements. This information alarmed me enough to conduct some discreet investigation. Using my growing network of business contacts, I learned that the house was actually in foreclosure proceedings. Brian owed $120,000 on a property currently valued at $180,000. Patricia had convinced him to borrow against the house multiple times, spending the money on luxury vacations, expensive jewelry, and a new car that she claimed were necessary investments in their future. The foreclosure timeline indicated the bank would seize the property within 4 months, unless the debt was satisfied. Brian had no idea how serious the situation had become, because Patricia was intercepting all correspondence from the mortgage company, just as she had intercepted my college acceptance letters years earlier. I realized this was an opportunity to protect my father while also securing my own future. Using my business banking relationship, I approached the mortgage company directly and learned the exact details of the debt situation. The bank was willing to accept a cash offer of $130,000 to close the foreclosure immediately, which would save them the time and expense of a lengthy legal process. I established a limited liability company called Heritage Property Holdings to purchase the house, keeping my personal name completely separate from the transaction. My plan was to surprise Brian and Patricia after graduation with the news that the house was safe, offer them the opportunity to stay rent-free, while Brian rebuilt his credit and gradually help him understand how Patricia's financial decisions had created the crisis. I never anticipated that Patricia would choose my graduation party as the moment to publicly humiliate me and announce their plans to abandon me entirely. Her cruel declaration that the house was too good for someone like me transformed my generous surprise into something entirely different. If Patricia wanted to treat me as an outsider who deserved nothing from this family, then she would discover exactly what that meant when someone actually had the power to make such decisions. The irony was overwhelming. Patricia was announcing that I wasn't worthy of the house while standing in a living room that I had secretly owned for 3 weeks. She was telling relatives about how Brian and she needed to start fresh, away from my negative influence, not realizing that her fresh start would definitely be happening, just not in the way she had planned. As Patricia's announcement sank in, the living room filled with an uncomfortable tension that seemed to energize her rather than embarrass her. She clearly felt empowered by the audience of relatives treating my public humiliation as a long overdue opportunity to establish her version of family dynamics. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, was the first to approach me after Patricia's declaration. Margaret had always been somewhat distant since Brian remarried, but I attributed that to natural grief and adjustment rather than any personal animosity. Now she looked at me with unmistakable disappointment and disapproval. "Shannon, I have to say I'm really disappointed in how you've been treating your father and Patricia." Margaret said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who believed she was delivering necessary tough love. "Patricia told us about the money you've been taking from Brian's wallet and how you've been manipulating him into paying for your college expenses when you should be supporting yourself." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I had never taken money from anyone, least of all my father, who was barely managing his own finances thanks to Patricia's spending habits. But as I looked around the room, I could see from the expressions on various relatives' faces that this story had been circulating for some time. My cousin Derek, whom I had helped get a summer job at Murphy's Auto Repair the previous year, approached with a cold expression that was completely unlike his usual friendly demeanor. Derek was 2 years younger than me, and I had always tried to be a supportive older cousin, sharing work opportunities and offering advice about college applications. "I can't believe you've been stealing from Uncle Brian," Derek said quietly, his voice filled with disgust. "After everything he's done for you since Aunt Sarah died, This is how you repay him. Jimmy Murphy told my dad that you're a hard worker, but apparently that's all an act to cover up what you're really doing at home. The realization that Patricia had been spreading these lies for months began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. She hadn't just been undermining my relationship with Brian. She had been systematically destroying my reputation with every person who mattered in our extended family network. Patricia moved through the room like a skilled politician, engaging in conversations that always seemed to circle back to my supposed character flaws and financial irresponsibility. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear while maintaining the pretense of discreet family discussion. It's just so hard when you try to give a young person every opportunity and they take advantage of your generosity, she said to my Uncle Robert, my grandfather's youngest son. Brian has sacrificed so much to support Shannon through college, taking on debt and working extra hours, and Shannon just expects more and more. We finally realized that enabling this behavior wasn't helping anyone. Brian stood near the kitchen doorway looking uncomfortable, but not contradicting anything Patricia said. When relatives asked him directly about the situation, he offered vague confirmations that things had been difficult, and they felt it was time for Shannon to become fully independent. His responses carried the exhaustion of someone who had been worn down by constant argument and manipulation, rather than genuine anger toward me. Patricia then made her most calculated move of the evening by announcing the details of their relocation to Phoenix. She explained that Brian's career prospects were much better in Arizona, where her brother Tony worked as a successful attorney and had connections throughout the insurance industry. She described Tony as someone who had built a life of real professional success and could help Brian reach his full potential without the financial drain of supporting an ungrateful stepson. Tony has always said that families should lift each other up, not hold each other back, Patricia announced to the room. He's excited to help Brian start fresh in an environment where his hard work will actually be appreciated and rewarded. The implicit message was clear. I was the obstacle preventing Brian from achieving success and happiness. Patricia had positioned herself and her family as the solution to problems that she had actually created through her financial mismanagement and manipulation. My grandfather Robert, my mother's father, made a brief attempt to defend me by mentioning my work ethic and academic achievements, but Patricia quickly redirected the conversation to focus on my supposed sense of entitlement and lack of gratitude. She suggested that Robert's defense of me was based on outdated information, and that he would understand the situation differently if he saw what Brian and I deal with on a daily basis. As the evening progressed, each relative who approached me did so with the clear assumption that I had been financially and emotionally abusing my father's generosity. Conversations that should have celebrated my college graduation instead became interventions about my supposed character defects and irresponsible behavior. The most painful moment came when Patricia loudly announced to the entire room that they would be moving to Phoenix within 2 weeks, having already secured Brian's transfer and begun the process of selling the house. She described their excitement about starting fresh and building a life together without the constant stress and financial pressure they had been experiencing. It's amazing how light and optimistic you feel when you finally make the decision to prioritize your own happiness and future, Patricia said, looking directly at me. Sometimes you have to choose between enabling someone's bad behavior and protecting your own well-being. The room buzzed with supportive murmurs from relatives who clearly believed Patricia's narrative completely. They saw me as a young man who had taken advantage of a grieving father's generosity and was now being held accountable through what they perceived as appropriate, tough love. As the party began winding down, each relative offered me cold, formal farewells that felt more like disappointed dismissals than congratulatory send-offs. They left with the clear belief that justice was being served, and that Brian and Patricia were making a difficult but necessary decision to protect themselves from my continued exploitation. I maintained my composure throughout the entire evening, responding to accusations with calm denials that nobody seemed interested in hearing. The irony of the situation was almost surreal. Patricia was celebrating her victory over someone she perceived as powerless and dependent, not realizing that she was actually talking to the person who now controlled the very foundation of her plans for the future. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a sleepless night of processing painful revelations. I had spent hours lying in bed listening to Patricia and Brian discuss logistics for their Phoenix move through the thin walls of our house. Their conversation included details about selling furniture, transferring Brian's insurance license to Arizona, and Patricia's excitement about finally living like adults without constant drama. At 8 in the morning, I called Marcus Rodriguez, the attorney who had handled the house purchase through my LLC. Marcus had been recommended by Linda Patterson at Hometown Eats, and his expertise in real estate transactions had made the property acquisition surprisingly straightforward. I explained that I needed to begin formal eviction proceedings immediately and requested that he accompany me to serve the notices in person. Marcus arrived at 9:30 carrying a leather portfolio containing the eviction documents, property deed, and purchase records. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had explained during our previous meetings that eviction cases involving family members often became emotionally charged even when the legal grounds were absolutely clear. "Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" Marcus asked as we walked toward the front door. "Once we serve these papers, there's no way to undo the psychological impact even if you later decide to allow them to stay." I thought about Patricia's cruel announcement the night before, and the months of lies she had spread about me to our entire family network. "I'm certain," I told him. "Patricia made it very clear that she doesn't consider me family, and I think it's time to respect her wishes." Patricia answered the door wearing her pink bathrobe and fluffy slippers, clearly expecting to see a delivery driver or neighbor. Her expression shifted from mild annoyance to confusion as she realized that I was standing there with a stranger in a business suit. "Shannon, what's this about?" she asked, her tone carrying the same dismissive authority she had used the night before. "If you're here to apologize for your behavior at the party, you can save your breath. Brian and I have made our decision." Marcus stepped forward and introduced himself professionally. "Ms. Patricia, I'm Marcus Rodriguez, and I represent the current owner of this property. I'm here to serve you with formal eviction notices." He handed her the official documents in their sealed envelope. Patricia's confusion deepened as she opened the envelope and began reading. Her face went through several distinct changes of expression: puzzlement, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of shocked rage that seemed to make her entire body tremble. "This is impossible," she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You can't evict us from our own house. This is some kind of mistake or fraud or something illegal." Brian appeared behind her, drawn by the commotion, still wearing his pajama pants and looking bewildered by the early morning drama. Patricia thrust the documents at him while continuing to voice her disbelief and outrage. "Brian, look at this. Someone is trying to steal our house. They're saying we have to move out in 30 days. This has to be some kind of scam." Brian read through the papers slowly, his confusion evident as he tried to process the legal language and official seals. Marcus provided calm, professional explanations of each document, while Patricia grew increasingly agitated. "These papers indicate that the property was purchased last month by Heritage Property Holdings LLC," Marcus explained. "The previous mortgage was satisfied at closing, and the new owner is exercising their legal right to terminate any existing occupancy arrangements." "But we live here," Patricia shouted. "We've lived here for years. You can't just decide to kick people out of their own home." That's when I spoke up for the first time since arriving. "Actually, Patricia, you can evict people when you own the house and they don't pay rent." The realization hit her in stages. First, she stared at me with complete incomprehension. Then she looked back at the documents, focusing on the details she had missed during her initial panicked reading. Finally, the truth settled over her like a heavy curtain. "You," she whispered, pointing at me with a shaking finger, "you're saying you bought this house. With what money you work at a garage making minimum wage?" Marcus provided the documentation showing my LLC's purchase agreement, the satisfaction of the previous mortgage, and the current deed registration. Brian examined each paper with the careful attention of someone whose world was fundamentally shifting. "Shannon," Brian said quietly, "how did you afford to buy a house? Where did you get $130,000? Before I could answer, Patricia's shock transformed into calculated anger. The same manipulative intelligence that had served her so well over the years began working to process this new situation and find ways to regain control. "This is fraud," she declared with sudden confidence. "There's no legal way Shannon could have acquired that much money without stealing it or committing some kind of crime. I'm calling the police and reporting this as financial fraud and identity theft." She pulled out her phone and began dialing, but Marcus interrupted her with professional calm. "Ma'am, I would strongly advise against filing false police reports. All financial transactions related to this purchase are completely documented and legal. My client's business income is properly reported to the IRS, and the property purchase was conducted through legitimate banking channels." "Business income," Patricia repeated, her voice filled with disbelief and growing rage. "What business? Shannon doesn't have a business. He's a college student who works part-time at an auto shop." That's when I explained about SM Digital Solutions, the mobile app development, and the contracts with regional businesses that had generated the income to purchase the house. As I described the software projects and client relationships, I watched Patricia's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and what looked like genuine shock that I had been capable of achieving something significant without her knowledge or approval. "You're lying," she said flatly. "You're making this up to justify stealing money from your father, or committing fraud or something else illegal. I know exactly what you are and what you're capable of, and it's not this." Brian looked between Patricia and me, clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about both our financial situation and my capabilities. "Shannon, if this is true, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think the house was in foreclosure?" "Because I wanted to surprise you after graduation," I replied. "I thought it would be nice to let you know the house was safe, and that you could stay here rent-free while you rebuilt your credit after Patricia's spending created the mortgage problems." Patricia's rage exploded at this statement. My spending. My spending. Everything I've done has been for this family. Every purchase was something we needed, or something that would help Brian's career or improve our quality of life. Marcus checked his watch and reminded us that he had other appointments, but offered to answer any additional questions about the legal process. Patricia demanded proof of my income and business operations, refusing to believe that I could have legitimately earned the money to purchase the property. The most revealing moment came when Patricia demanded to know why I would go behind their backs instead of helping the family if I actually had access to significant money. Her assumption was that any resources I possessed should automatically be used to solve problems that her financial mismanagement had created, without any acknowledgement of how those problems had developed or any appreciation for the sacrifice such help would represent. As Marcus and I prepared to leave, Patricia made her final threat of the morning. "I'm not giving up on this house," she declared. "I'm calling my brother Tony in Phoenix. He's a successful attorney and he'll know how to fight this illegal scheme. You might think you're clever, Shannon, but you're about to discover what happens when you try to steal from family." Brian stood in the doorway looking completely overwhelmed by revelations that had shattered his understanding of our family's financial reality, Patricia's decision-making, and my capabilities. The quiet, defeated expression on his face suggested that he was beginning to realize how thoroughly he had been manipulated, but the process of accepting that realization would clearly take time. The afternoon following the eviction notice delivery, Patricia spent hours on the phone with various relatives presenting her version of the morning's events. From my bedroom, I could hear fragments of her conversations as she described me as mentally unstable, claimed I had stolen money from Brian, and insisted that my house purchase was definitely illegal and would be reversed by the authorities within days. Her most frequent call was to her brother Tony in Phoenix, whom she described to everyone as a successful attorney with connections to judges and prosecutors throughout Arizona. Patricia's confidence seemed to rebuild with each conversation, as she convinced herself that Tony would arrive with legal solutions that would resolve everything in her favor. The next evening, Tony arrived from Phoenix, driving a rented black BMW sedan and wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit that clearly impressed Patricia. He was a tall, thin man in his late 40s with carefully styled silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Tony entered our house like a commanding general, taking control of a crisis situation. He carried a leather briefcase and immediately began asking detailed questions about the eviction notice, demanding to see all documentation, and taking notes on a yellow legal pad while making authoritative statements about property rights and fraudulent transactions. Patricia, I want you to understand that what happened here is not legally sustainable, Tony announced in a voice that carried absolute certainty. Shannon may have temporarily confused some local officials with forged documents or false information, but property law is very clear about family rights and fraudulent transfers. He explained to Brian that children cannot legally steal family property from their parents, and that any purchase agreement made without Brian's knowledge and consent would be automatically voided once proper legal challenges were filed. Tony used phrases like federal fraud statutes and property rights violations that sounded impressive, but left me wondering about the specific legal theories he was referencing. I'm scheduling a formal family meeting for tomorrow evening, Tony declared. Shannon needs to understand the serious legal consequences he's facing, and we need to get this situation resolved before it becomes a federal case involving the FBI and IRS. Patricia was visibly relieved to have someone taking charge who seemed to validate her perspective. She spent the evening calling relatives to inform them that her attorney brother had arrived and would be exposing Shannon's fraud within days. To neighbors who had heard about the eviction drama, she explained that the situation was under control and would be resolved by qualified legal professionals. Brian seemed caught between relief that someone with apparent expertise was addressing the situation and continuing confusion about how the financial and legal complexities had developed without his awareness. Tony spoke to him with the patronizing sympathy of someone comforting a victim of deception. Brian, you need to understand that you've been systematically manipulated by someone who clearly has significant psychological problems, Tony explained. Shannon's behavior shows classic signs of antisocial personality disorder and financial manipulation tactics that are actually quite sophisticated for someone his age. The next morning, I called Marcus Rodriguez to inform him about Tony's arrival and threats. Marcus asked me to provide Tony's full name and law firm affiliation so he could research his background and credentials before the evening meeting. I had assumed this was standard professional courtesy, but Marcus's tone suggested he had concerns about Tony's claims and legal theories. That afternoon, Marcus called back with information that completely changed my understanding of the situation. Tony Rodriguez, not actually Rodriguez, but Tony Mendez, had indeed been a licensed attorney in Arizona, but was disbarred 3 years ago for misappropriating client funds from his personal injury practice. The State Bar Association's disciplinary record showed that Tony had stolen over $60,000 from client settlement accounts to cover gambling debts and personal expenses. Since his disbarment, Tony had been working as a sales representative at Desert Auto Palace, a used car dealership in Phoenix, earning commission-based income selling vehicles to customers with poor credit. His current legal knowledge was limited to whatever he remembered from his previous practice, and he had no authority to provide legal advice or representation in any jurisdiction. This information definitely needs to be shared at tomorrow's meeting, Marcus advised. If Mr. Mendez is threatening you with legal action based on his supposed expertise, your father deserves to know about his actual qualifications and recent history. I also decided to call my grandfather Robert to inform him about the situation and invite him to attend the family meeting. Robert had always been supportive during the difficult years after my mother's death, and his presence might provide some balance to Tony's aggressive approach. Robert was shocked to learn about the eviction notice and Patricia's claims about my supposed fraud, but he wasn't surprised to hear that financial problems had been developing without Brian's full awareness. "I've been worried about your father's situation for months," Robert told me. "Patricia's been pushing him to make expensive purchases and take trips they clearly couldn't afford, but Brian wouldn't listen to concerns about money management." That evening, Tony conducted what he called a preliminary legal assessment by interrogating me about my business income-client relationships and the house purchase process. He maintained the authoritative demeanor of someone conducting an official investigation, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to find inconsistencies or evidence of illegal activity. "Shannon, I need you to understand that what you've done here constitutes multiple federal crimes," Tony declared after reviewing the eviction papers. "Property fraud, identity theft, mortgage fraud, and elder abuse are all serious felonies that can result in decades in federal prison." He explained that his preliminary research had already identified several irregularities in the purchase transaction that would definitely trigger federal investigations once he filed the appropriate complaints. Tony claimed to have contacts throughout the justice system who would fast-track the case due to its obvious criminal nature. Patricia listened to Tony's assessment with growing satisfaction, clearly feeling vindicated in her belief that I had committed crimes and would face serious consequences. She made several comments about how she had always known something was wrong with my behavior and felt relieved that qualified professionals were finally addressing the situation. Brian remained quiet throughout Tony's interrogation, but I could see him struggling to reconcile Tony's accusations with his long-term observations of my character and behavior. The cognitive dissonance of believing that his generally responsible son had suddenly become a sophisticated criminal seemed to be creating genuine psychological stress. The most revealing moment came when Tony demanded that I provide complete financial records for my business, threatening to subpoena everything if I refused to cooperate voluntarily. His aggressive approach and authoritative language clearly impressed Patricia, who began making comments about how real attorneys handle situations like this. As the evening ended, Tony announced that he would be conducting additional research overnight and would present his complete legal strategy at tomorrow's family meeting. He requested that Brian invite any other relatives who might be affected by the criminal conspiracy so they could understand the serious nature of the situation. Patricia spent the rest of the evening calling relatives to inform them about Tony's preliminary findings and invite them to witness the exposure of Shannon's criminal behavior. Her confidence had completely returned, and she spoke as if my legal downfall was already certain. I went to bed that night knowing that tomorrow's meeting would be unlike anything Patricia or Tony anticipated, but feeling genuinely sad about the impact their upcoming humiliation might have on Brian's relationship with Patricia's family. The evidence Marcus had gathered about Tony's disbarment and current employment would devastate Patricia's credibility, but it would also force Brian to confront how thoroughly he had been deceived about the people he trusted most. The family meeting convened the following evening in our living room, with Patricia having invited several neighbors as witnesses to what she expected would be my legal and personal destruction. Mrs. Henderson from next door, the Johnsons from across the street, and old Mr. Pete from 2 houses down all arrived looking uncomfortable but clearly curious about the drama that had been unfolding over the past few days. Tony had prepared extensively for what he clearly viewed as his moment of professional triumph. He wore his most expensive suit, carried multiple legal folders, and had prepared a presentation that he described as comprehensive evidence of criminal activity that would definitively prove Shannon's guilt. Brian sat quietly in his favorite chair, looking exhausted by the constant conflict and increasingly confused by the legal complexities that seemed to change with each conversation. Grandfather Robert arrived shortly before the meeting began, offering me a supportive nod while surveying the assembled crowd with obvious concern. Marcus Rodriguez arrived precisely on time, carrying his own portfolio of documents and maintaining the calm, professional demeanor that had impressed me throughout our business relationship. Patricia looked annoyed by his presence, having expected this to be Tony's show, but Tony welcomed Marcus as an opportunity to demonstrate his legal expertise in front of another attorney. "Mr. Rodriguez." Tony began with condescending authority. "I assume Shannon has hired you to help minimize the legal consequences of his criminal behavior. I want you to understand that cooperation with law enforcement at this point might help reduce his eventual sentence, but the evidence of fraud and property theft is absolutely overwhelming." Marcus responded with polite professionalism while opening his portfolio. "Mr. Mendez, before we discuss legal theories, I think everyone present should have access to complete information about the situation, including your background and current qualifications." The use of Mendez instead of the Rodriguez named Tony had been using immediately caught Patricia's attention. Tony's confident expression flickered slightly, but he maintained his authoritative pose while demanding to know why Marcus was attempting to deflect attention from Shannon's criminal behavior. Marcus calmly distributed copies of Tony's disbarment records from the Arizona State Bar, his disciplinary hearing transcripts, and his current employment verification from Desert Auto Palace. The documents detailed how Tony had stolen over $60,000 from client accounts, been investigated by both state and federal authorities, and was currently prohibited from practicing law in any jurisdiction. The silence in the room was profound as neighbors and family members read through the documents. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally a kind of desperate anger as she realized that her brother's authority was completely fictional. "These documents are fake," Patricia announced, but her voice lacked conviction. "This is obviously something Shannon created to discredit Tony because he knows Tony can expose his crimes." Tony's carefully constructed facade crumbled as he realized that his disbarment was now public knowledge to everyone present. He attempted to maintain some authority by claiming the disbarment was politically motivated and resulted from representing clients against powerful corporate interests. But Marcus had included the specific details of his theft and gambling addiction that made such explanations impossible. Brian looked at the documents with the expression of someone whose world was collapsing for the second time in 3 days. The realization that he had been deceived not just about our financial situation, but also about the credibility of the people Patricia had brought in to solve their problems, seemed to fundamentally shake his trust in his own judgment. As Tony's credibility evaporated, Patricia made increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her narrative about my supposed criminal behavior. She demanded that Marcus provide proof that my business income was legitimate, accused me of psychological manipulation of everyone present, and claimed that the entire meeting was part of an elaborate conspiracy to cover up my theft of family property. That's when I decided to play the recordings I had accidentally captured on my phone over the past several months. During Patricia's frequent long phone conversations, she often forgot that I was home and spoke loudly enough for her voice to carry through the house. My phone had been recording voice memos for a college project, and several of Patricia's conversations had been inadvertently captured during these recording sessions. The first recording featured Patricia talking to her sister about her plans for getting Brian to see Shannon's true nature, and her excitement about finally having Brian to myself without his son constantly interfering. The second recording captured her laughing about Brian's stupidity regarding their financial situation and her confidence that she could keep him in the dark about the debt problems until Shannon was gone and we could declare bankruptcy. The most damaging recording was a conversation between Patricia and Tony from 2 weeks earlier, where she admitted that her accusations about my stealing money were completely made up, but were necessary to turn the family against Shannon permanently. In that conversation, Tony encouraged her manipulative strategies and suggested additional ways to destroy Shannon's credibility with relatives and neighbors. As the recordings played, the assembled neighbors and family members listened with growing shock and disgust. Patricia's voice, clearly audible and unmistakable, described Brian as easy to manipulate and expressed satisfaction about destroying Shannon's relationship with everyone who matters. Her laughter while discussing Brian's financial vulnerability was particularly chilling to everyone present. Brian's reaction was the most painful to witness. He sat in complete silence as he heard Patricia's true opinion of him, her deliberate deception about our family's financial crisis, and her calculated plan to isolate me from everyone who might support me. The man who had spent 3 years believing that his wife loved him and that his son was ungrateful now understood that both assumptions had been completely wrong. Patricia's final desperate strategy was to claim that the recordings were taken out of context or manipulated somehow to misrepresent her true feelings. But Tony's voice was also clearly audible in the conversations discussing specific strategies for legal intimidation and expressing confidence that his attorney credentials would prevent anyone from questioning their approach. Mr. Pete, the neighbor from down the street, spoke up with the moral clarity of someone whose long life had given him perspective on human behavior. Patricia, I've listened to these recordings and there's no context that makes this acceptable. You've been lying to everyone about everything, and it's time to take responsibility for what you've done. The meeting concluded with Patricia and Tony both thoroughly exposed and discredited in front of everyone who mattered in their immediate social network. The neighbors left quickly, clearly uncomfortable with having witnessed such intimate family dysfunction. Grandfather Robert offered to stay and help process the evening's revelations, but Brian asked for time alone to think through everything he had learned. As Tony packed his materials and prepared to return to Phoenix, his parting comment revealed the complete collapse of his and Patricia's strategy. "This isn't over," he told me. "We'll find other ways to fight this." But his voice carried defeat rather than threat, and everyone present understood that his credibility was permanently destroyed. Patricia spent her final hour in the house making phone calls to relatives, attempting to convince them that the evening's revelations were somehow part of my continued manipulation, rather than evidence of her own deception. But the recordings had been too clear and comprehensive for anyone to maintain belief in her version of events. The week following the confrontation transformed our household in ways that felt both dramatic and surprisingly natural. Patricia and Tony left for Phoenix within 3 days, their departure marked by hurried packing and muttered complaints rather than the triumphant relocation they had anticipated. Patricia's final words to me were threats about future legal action that everyone understood were empty bluster from someone whose credibility had been permanently shattered. Brian chose to stay, accepting my offer to rent the guest bedroom while he worked to rebuild both his finances and his understanding of what had actually been happening in his life for the past 3 years. The first honest conversation we had shared in years took place the morning after Patricia left, when he apologized for allowing her manipulation to damage our relationship. "Shannon, I need you to understand how completely I was fooled," Brian said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "Patricia was so skilled at making her lies seem reasonable that I never questioned the basic assumptions she was building. When someone you trust tells you the same story repeatedly with small details that seem to confirm it, you start believing things that should have been obviously false." I helped Brian contact a financial counselor who specialized in debt recovery and credit repair. Together, we reviewed 3 years of financial records that revealed the full scope of Patricia's spending and deception. She had used Brian's credit cards for over $40,000 in luxury purchases, convinced him to refinance the house twice to fund what she described as investment opportunities, and systematically intercepted and discarded financial documents that would have revealed their mounting debt. The most shocking discovery was that Patricia had been forging Brian's signature on various financial documents for over a year, including loan applications and credit card agreements. This constituted multiple felonies that could have resulted in serious criminal charges. But Brian chose not to pursue prosecution, feeling that Patricia's public humiliation and loss of her social support network was sufficient consequence. Within 2 weeks, I hired Brian as the administrative coordinator for SM Digital Solutions. His insurance industry experience and attention to detail made him valuable for managing client contracts, scheduling project deadlines, and handling the business logistics that I had been struggling to manage while focusing on software development. This arrangement gave him steady income while allowing me to expand my business operations. Grandfather Robert became a regular visitor, often joining us for dinner and sharing family stories about my mother, that helped Brian and me reconnect with positive memories that Patricia's presence had overshadowed. These conversations revealed how much family history and emotional connection we had lost during the years when Patricia was actively discouraging family relationships that didn't center around her. The extended family members who had shunned me at the graduation party gradually learned the truth about Patricia's lies and attempted various forms of reconciliation. Aunt Margaret called to apologize, explaining that she had believed Patricia's stories about my stealing money because Patricia seemed so genuinely concerned and upset. Cousin Derek stopped by to apologize in person, admitting that he had felt uncomfortable believing the theft accusations, but hadn't known how to question an adult's assessment of the situation. I accepted these apologies with grace but established clear boundaries about future relationships. The experience had taught me that some family members were willing to believe terrible things about me without asking for my perspective, and that realization changed how I approached those relationships going forward. My business continued growing through referrals and reputation. Linda Patterson at Hometown Eats recommended me to several other regional business owners, leading to contracts for inventory management systems, customer relationship platforms, and e-commerce solutions. Within 6 months, SM Digital Solutions was generating enough revenue to support both Brian and myself comfortably while building substantial savings for future expansion. The house itself became a symbol of resilience and forward planning rather than conflict and revenge. Brian and I renovated the guest bathroom and updated the kitchen projects that gave us opportunities to work together on practical problems while rebuilding our relationship. Brian's mechanical skills complemented my technical abilities, and we discovered that collaboration came naturally once Patricia's divisive influence was removed. The most meaningful change was the return of family dinners and casual conversations that had disappeared during Patricia's tenure. Without constant tension and manipulation, Brian and I rediscovered the easy communication and mutual respect that had characterized our relationship before his remarriage. We could discuss business challenges, family memories, and future plans without navigating hidden agendas or emotional landmines. 6 months after Patricia's departure, Brian had improved his credit score significantly and was considering purchasing his own small home near our neighborhood. However, he had also begun contributing substantially to household expenses and seemed genuinely comfortable with our living arrangement. We discussed the possibility of converting the house into a duplex that would give him complete independence while maintaining our business partnership. The experience taught me profound lessons about the difference between protecting yourself and seeking revenge. My original plan had been to surprise Brian and Patricia with generous help after graduation, but Patricia's public humiliation forced me to choose between allowing continued abuse and defending myself with the resources I had quietly developed. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about punishing Patricia, but about demonstrating that patient preparation and honest work could overcome manipulation and lies. Most importantly, I learned that genuine family relationships can survive and recover from significant damage when they're built on real love and respect rather than obligation and control. Brian's willingness to acknowledge how thoroughly he had been deceived, apologize for the pain his choices had caused, and work actively to rebuild our relationship showed me that authentic connections can be stronger after surviving serious challenges. The business success that made everything possible had grown from a simple desire to solve practical problems for people who appreciated good work. Every client relationship was built on delivering real value rather than promising impossible solutions, and that foundation of honest competence had created opportunities that no amount of manipulation could duplicate or destroy. Looking back, I realized that Patricia's greatest miscalculation was assuming that someone she perceived as powerless would always remain powerless. Her worldview was built around controlling people through emotional manipulation and financial dependency, but she never understood that real strength comes from developing genuine capabilities and maintaining authentic relationships. Today, Brian and I often joke about how different our lives might have been if Patricia had simply treated me with basic respect and honesty. If she had supported our family relationships instead of undermining them, if she had managed finances responsibly instead of creating crisis through deception. And if she had celebrated my achievements instead of trying to minimize them, she could have been part of a genuinely successful and happy family. Instead, her need to control and diminish others led to her losing everything she claimed to want: a secure home, financial stability, family relationships, and social respect. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Patricia's efforts to exclude me from the family had resulted in her excluding herself from a family that was stronger, happier, and more prosperous without her divisive presence. The final lesson came from recognizing that the best response to betrayal and manipulation isn't always confrontation or revenge, but sometimes simply building something better and letting the contrast speak for itself. Patricia had spent years trying to convince everyone that I was worthless and incapable, but the reality of my business success, character development, and positive relationships provided more powerful contradiction than any argument could have achieved. As I finish telling this story, I'm curious about your own experiences with difficult family situations. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was systematically undermining your relationships with other people you cared about? How did you handle the situation when you realized what was happening? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of challenges in your own life, please hit the like button to help others find it. Consider subscribing for more stories about overcoming family conflicts and building genuine success through honest effort. And if you think someone you know might benefit from hearing about patient preparation and strategic thinking in difficult situations, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening to this story about how quiet strength and authentic relationships can overcome manipulation and deception. I hope you found something valuable in Shannon's journey from humiliation to triumph, and I wish you success in building the kind of life that no one can take away from you, because it's built on your own genuine capabilities and character.